All right, good evening, everyone. As I said, I'm the head of communications and student relations here at Respect. I am so honored to be reading the introduction for our wonderful speaker today. Moira McGuire is a nurse and serves as the Division Chief of Ancillary Services and lead for integrative health and wellness in the Internal Medicine Clinic at a Maryland hospital. She has spent her career working with vulnerable populations in behavioral health oncology and more recently with wounded, ill, and injured service members. This was the impetus for establishing the Sexual Health and Intimacy Work Group to address these critical needs in this battled, injured population and has resulted in a permanent sexual health and intimacy service in primary care. She is certified as a sexuality counselor with the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, the AASECT, and facilitated the certification of 8 additional staff members. I'm really excited to introduce her. And then for question and answer sessions, Rubina Tareen, who I introduced herself before, is a board member of Respect Graduate School, will be joining her for question and answers. But please give a warm welcome to Moira McGuire.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Whenever I'm asked whether I want the good news or the bad news first, I always ask for the bad news first. So I will do the same for you this evening. The bad news is that the imam, who is actually supposed to be the scholar and expert on the Islamic piece of this, is not coming this evening. So you guys are stuck with just me. But alhamdulillah, Rubina is going to is going to fill in.
Default person.
And so we thought that we would make this a little more of a conversation.
I can switch because this might be better.
Yes. Okay. I can clearly share with you the work that I do because I, spend my days talking about sex and sexual health and the importance of it. And of course, as a Muslim, I can, share my understanding of how I think it aligns beautifully with Islam, but I'm certainly not the expert in that arena. I started this work about 6 years ago, and it was in response to a significant clinical need that we saw. It wasn't, we found clinically that there were a lot of providers who were just very uncomfortable talking about sex. And so these assumptions that, if you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, a psych nurse practitioner, even your PCM, that these issues would come up in the exam room and that they would be handled appropriately. And of course, what we found was that it really wasn't. And so we started building a service, and it has been, it's taken a while for it to successfully, I would say, launch, but it's getting larger every day. And we made a very conscious decision to about 4 years ago to place it within integrative health and wellness. Because, we understand that sex is a healthy behavior, right? Just like sleeping, eating well, exercising. These are all healthy behaviors, and sex is as well. And unfortunately, oftentimes, the way that we're socialized to understand it, sometimes within a religious context, introduces some elements of shame, judgment, that are not helpful, right, for having a sexually healthy experience, however people choose to define that. And so that's the work that we've been doing. There are some very common issues that we come up against, and one of the very large ones is the fact that many women don't understand that they function very differently than men in terms of their sexual response cycle. So, sharing that information actually can be very positive and affirming. So I would imagine that people, might have questions my idea wasn't that I would necessarily just exclusively talk about my work, but more importantly, kind of, how this aligns with, our teachings Islamically. So it might be better if Rubina spoke just a little bit, and then we could.
Well, I guess I didn't really prepare anything, but I could just talk, just my experience being a Muslim and what I have learned actually later in life about this issue, and how in the Muslim world it is still a kind of a subject that is sort of taboo. Like, you don't talk to your younger children, boys and girls, about it. Like Moira said, this is something part of life, and it's a very healthy thing to have a proper education. And I must say that last week when Rabbi was talking about that how they have this group of education especially for the girls, before even they get into any relationship with the men, and they train them. They talk about every aspect of being feminine and sexuality, and so it's like they have this idea of being, especially for a woman, being a full human being and a control of their emotions and their bodies. And this subject was actually traditionally prophetic time. It was very open because Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he talked about these issues. So gender relation was very much part of the discussion, part of the revelation, and also included in Islam and husband and wife relationship. So the sexual behavior is just like any other behavior, has certain rules. Like, it's, of course, all tradition have this, is something is for free. Like, you could just go act upon on your impulse, because this is what really differentiate us from the animal kingdom, that we have some commitment which goes with it. Yes, it is for procreation, but the difference is that human beings procreate and they kind of stick with it. They don't have their pleasure and then just leave. So that's the difference. And of course, through revelation, through scriptures, that we are taught that behavior. So I would say that Islam is not a whole lot of different than Judaism and Christianity, but it has also pretty much where woman is very much elevated. Like, a lot of time in marriage, in Islamic marriage, people misunderstand. They think, okay, if husband and wife is married, so this is like somehow it's a given right to a man. Like, okay, there are a couple of one or two sentences in the Quran are taken totally out of context for that relationship. So consent is a consent, what they're talking about this day and age is actually pretty similar. Same thing for the marriage for a woman is a very misunderstood, even for the Muslim world, because as we were talking earlier, that is the reason the people, Western world, misunderstand that this whole oppression of women, or woman doesn't have the right, or she's not equal. So that is something because Muslims have misunderstood that aspect of Islam, and it's very cultural. We also talked about that so many traditions have brought into Islam as Islam started to spread in a different part of the world. people tend to keep a lot of their cultural behavior, and which include this marriage behavior, sexual behavior. So those things were already there. So, you know, they adopted Islam, but not necessarily they changed a lot of cultural behavior. So as far as in a marriage, you know, there are, in Islam, there's definitely social rules of engagement between men and women. We have some conditions, and dress code is one of the conditions. Also, professionalism is one of the conditions. You know, men and women who are not related to each other, there is a certain way of engaging with each other. Islam allows for men and women to work together. Islam allows for professional relationship, but then there is certain things that you don't do in those relationships. And there are certain relationships is only are permissible in a marriage situation. But that doesn't mean the courtship is not allowed in Islam. Obviously, it's allowed in Islam, but with certain conditions. So we have to really understand that there is a lot of negativity around understanding Muslim men and women and their cultural and their traditions in a negative ways. But if you do see something where you feel that, oh, you know, women doesn't seem like they don't have the rights, but remember, it's really not Islam, because the first right in the Quran, or a first revelation, what we call a Sharia, that God gave to Prophet Muhammad, and he said, tell these pagan Arabs who used to kill their baby girls after they were born, because of course they didn't have amniocentesis, or they couldn't determine the sex, which still goes on all over the world, believe it or not. People don't want to have baby girls. So that hasn't really changed much from pagan Arabs to now. We just have modernized things. So the first rule came to the Prophet Muhammad. It was for the woman, to defend the woman, to protect the woman. And it actually, there was a verse revealed that says that to Prophet Muhammad, that God is saying that tell this pagan Arab, stop killing your baby girls, because on the day of judgment they will ask you, what was the crime that we committed that we were killed for? So, I mean, that's really a start of a legal system which came to protect the woman. So I would say, in same way, a prophet took everything very seriously when it came to women. Even in his last sermon, he was so concerned that the woman will be mistreated, that he make sure that he told his follower to make sure to treat your wives and treat your woman in the best way that you can. So I think I'm going to leave it here. And we probably, I mean, I don't know if you want to open up the discussion or.
Sure, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
I would like to clarify one thing that, you know, I grew up Catholic, and in Catholicism, sex is just for procreation.
Oh, thank you.
And
yes.
so in Islam, it is for procreation and not just for procreation.
Thank
it's
you for
for
clearing
many
that.
reasons.
Yes.
Yes. So I think that was
That's important to know.
very,
yes.
very
Thank you.
in terms of
And you know, in Islam, if you're married, you don't have to have children. So it's not a sin not to have children. So I'm so glad you brought that up. So I guess what we could do is maybe if somebody has a question that we can elaborate, so we keep it a little more engaging, maybe change a format a little bit different. I kind of like her idea. So I think you have heard the previous two faiths talking about this. You may have a question related to those previous talk, and you may want to have some competitive questions that she can take, even I can take, and we can take it from there. I think that'd be a good idea. So we want to just know what you're thinking, or what you have heard or what you have read, and it would really help us to engage. Yes.
How the rules are the same or different.
Mm-hmm.
Have an online relationship, texting. Oh, sorry. So I think it's changed for a lot of people, but again, as Rubina mentioned, this idea that men and women, courting or not, right, would not be, for instance, in a room alone with the door closed, right? So, sometimes when I hear about the things that have recently made, the media about, women in compromising positions, that Islamically, that like if you're following that guidance, then those things wouldn't happen because you wouldn't be in that position. Like you could certainly have a conversation, you could meet with somebody, but that the door would be open, that you wouldn't, close the door. But in terms of courtship, and again, people, Islam is really very, it's a very kind of flexible and gentle thing. And in that gentle nature, people can interpret in lots of different ways. So if you were to ask 20 different Muslim families how they handle like a courting for their children, you might get 18 different answers. Some people are okay with, online like texting or emailing. Some people don't want any of that. Some people will have their children get together, but there'll be, or their young adult children, and there'll be other adults in the room. It's really kind of, implemented in different ways. But there is this idea that you would not, again, whether courting or not, that you wouldn't be in a closed place with someone who is opposite gender, who you're not related to. So.
I guess Islamically, like I talked about marriage. So marriage has to have a consent, because in Arabic, for word marriage is used aqd, that means a contract. So that contract has to have taken place between the two, what would you call, sane adults. And they are equally involved, men or women are equally involved in that consent. So that means that women have the right to talk about what she wants in a marriage, or where she wants to live, or whether she wants to have children, or whether the man can provide for him, or can I work. So it's really something. See, Islam in a lot of ways is like backward than the Western world in a marriage. So what you do is you get all these difficult things out of the way even before you kind of fall for each other. So you can consider 20 men before you find a person that you like. But in the meanwhile, it's more like you're looking for a business partner. It actually would be like that. Your marriage is an institution and it's an investment, and you want the best person for a man and a woman to be your business partner. So the courtship is allowed, like she said, but it has to be out in the open. So it shouldn't happen behind closed door. So really, just like the Judaism and Christianity, any kind of intimate relationship is not allowed, is considered a sin. So it would be the same thing in Islam. So to discourage that, it says to keep, usually families are with you, or you're out somewhere in a public, or here in a Western world, okay, you have to adopt a little bit, because now a lot of people don't have families, a lot of people just, kids are raised here, so they don't find anything wrong having a friendship with the opposite sex. So, and in that situation, what do? You just allow them to be at the mall, you allow them to be at the public places. So you have to make some flexibility. in your traditional and culture, because some cultures are very tight about it. And arranged marriage are not some, I mean, Islamic marriage are somewhat arranged, like the parents can be fully involved in both sides in marriage, but it's not arranged in a way where the girl or the boy don't have a consent. They both have to have an equal say in, and if the girl doesn't want to get married, it will be actually not permissible to force her into marriage. So if we have heard and seen and watched movies, that's all really non-Islamic.
You know, I will say something about the courtship is that, you know, it's not encouraged to be long. As a matter of fact, as soon as you get a sense of whether this person might work for you, you should get married as soon as possible, right? Because, so for instance, in Catholicism, right, I mean, divorce is, you know, frowned upon, right? In Islam, it's certainly, it's permissible. Of all the things that are permissible, it's the thing that Allah hates the most, but divorce is permissible. So you're not supposed to engage in this, like, you know, paralysis by analysis, trying to find like the absolute perfect person, right? You're supposed to, once you have a sense, then you move forward. And, you know, if the marriage works out eventually, that's a beautiful thing. And if not, that's okay as well, because the idea is, again, to build a life together and to provide protection for the children, right? And that protection comes within a family. And then even when divorce occurs, then it's still the man's responsibility to make sure that he cares for those children. So courtships, and it's interesting because, you know, studies show that the longer people live together before they get married, the less likely that marriage is to last. And so, you know, Islamically, you are definitely, you know, discouraged from like courting for years. So
Maybe we should take another question, maybe different nature of a question.
so.
Could you please explain the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad's first wife?
To Khadija.
Yeah, so, you know, Khadija was 15 years his senior?
Yeah.
Yes, 15 years his
40
senior.
years.
She was a successful businesswoman. She was a widow. And of course, we know that all of the marriages serve as an example, right, for us. So this being the first example, I think it's amazingly powerful to speak about the role. As a matter of fact, I have to share something that I got on one of my WhatsApp groups. I'm sorry, but this is from one of the scholars. It says, the prophet was born in the lap of a woman. He was delicately wrapped up and nursed by a woman. The first person to see his beautiful and illuminated smile was a woman. When his mother passed away in Abwa, he tearfully came back to Mecca with a woman. When he returned from Hira, the first person who covered him was a woman, and the first person he spoke to was a woman. A woman was the first to believe in him. A woman was the first to pray with him. A woman was the first to die for him. When he delivered khutbah, a woman was the first to build a minbar for him. When he left this world, he left resting his head on a woman. His lineage continued through a woman, and from his final words were,
It's beautiful.
I give you counsel that you be good to your women. So I think that speaks to the status of women in Islam.
So I just want to quickly tell you the story. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he married to Khadija, her name was Khadija. Now Khadija is from a very noble tribe from Makkah. And she's a successful woman, but Meccan women really did not travel with their caravans. They were different than the women from Medina. Medina women were very, out there, doing things. So now she did hear that this is the guy named Muhammad, and he can really bring you much more profit than some of the other people who are going with the caravan. So she hired him as a merchant to trade her goods. So once she saw the return, of course he was already known being a trustworthy, and Makkan just loved him, his personality and his uprightness in a business. So now he's 25-year-old and she's a 40-year-old and widowed twice. And she sent him the message of a marriage. Now we are talking about the 7th century, and it's pretty forward thinking actually for a woman at that time. And he's a young man. Of course, he didn't know he was going to be a prophet. He's thrilled he actually feel like he was honored to be offered for a marriage for a woman of her stature. So, and he was actually employed by her. She was his boss. So it's kind of, start of the first marriage. Any other question?
I'm going to get back to current times and try to be specific. Okay, you're not married, but you know you're going to be married. You're engaged, essentially. And in public, say in a movie theater, there's a Coke ad, by the way, where you're a little shy and then eventually puts his arm around it, that guy. No, she actually puts her arm around him. Okay, but, okay, that would be one stage. The whole notion of hugging and snuggling, which is a big part of Christian marriage, pre-marriage too. And then the notion of kissing. Okay, so we got all those specific things. Do you do any of them? As long as you do follow the other rules, you're not behind a closed door, you're not alone, that kind of thing.
Oh, Art, if you only knew.
I would say, if we want to follow the tradition, what is said is any, it doesn't describe that, some people go as far as shaking hands or even any kind of touch. No, that's really your interpretation that how far that you want to take that. So what is allowed is behind closed door and having any kind of sexual relation. That is which is forbidden in Islam. After that, really is what you want to interpret. How far do you want to go with that? Now, if it was an innocent touch or if it was an innocent hug and it doesn't go any further, you can't, it depends who's interpreting. Like, you kind of live in a society which that's happening every day. So if you start telling the kids don't shake hand, you're living in a society, it's like you're really restricting their movement, which probably they might think of nothing. But we are talking about, if you shook hand and what is next and what is next and what is next, that it's like, intention is a major, major part of human behavior. I could be looking at you and, thinking like, okay, you're a perfectly gentleman. You could be my brother. You could be my father. And I can shake your hand or whatever and think nothing of it. But if my heart is thinking something else with the opposite sex, that's where you kind of it's all self-controlled behavior. Like I said, what separates us from animal is that commitment. Animals can procreate. They can outdo human in a lot of things. But yet the God Almighty says in the Quran that I perfected my creation, and that was human being. It's not that we are perfect in some kind of looks and all that. He perfected the human creation is because of willingly we will follow his command, like willingly we will submit. So really at the end it does your youth, we're not only talking about the youth, we're talking about all ages where people are interacting with each other. Like you have to have that self-control. So this is what really the Islamic teaching is all about. It's not about others, it's what your intentions are. And same thing like I said in the marriage, people marry for visas. There are people who come here, including Muslims, men and women. Is that marriage valid? I don't know, but the intention's not there. Intention is that I'm marrying this person for better and for the worse and for life, right? So if you put some other intention, now that's impure from both sides. Unless if the other party is not knowing, that means that's even worse, because now you are cheating to the person that you're marrying. So really, if we get into such a nitty-gritty, it will make life very difficult, living the way now the Western world is. And also, I think because the society is more open here, like in a Muslim world where men and women were kept so separately, by the way, really, that was not a very Islamic thing, because prophetic time, they share the social space. Muslim men and women were together. That's how Islam was built. They both had the same mission. So they were working towards, build the society, build the Islamic society, have the stronger foundation. So it just somehow, as is, actually you were just talking about one tradition. It was about, didn't we talk about it was a traditional thing?
Was this the idea of women in the home and not being seen?
Yeah. Can you please talk about that?
So I don't know if people are familiar with Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And so during that time, of course, all great works in Greek and Latin were being translated, including works of Aristotle. And apparently this was actually a very strong belief of Aristotle. And so the idea is that through the translation that it actually found its way into Islam, but that it's not a genuinely Islamic teaching.
Yeah.
And I think that you see that a lot. You see like these different influences, but when you go back to, the actual Quran and Hadith, that you don't see these things like reinforced or supported. So there are a lot of cultural practices that...
She mentioned the word Hadith. I don't know if most of you familiar with that. If you're not, you're shaking your... Okay, is Hadith, Quran is a revelation. We believe that, it was revealed to Prophet Muhammad through Gabriel, peace be upon him. Just like the previous prophets, Quran is a revelation. But then there was another literature and a material which we call Hadith. That means that these were the tradition that they're not in the Quran, but they were things that prophets said and did, people recorded it. So that recording has, now there are many aspects of those. It will be, I guess it will be more like Gospels, like where the disciple kind of, try to write. But in Hadith material, there are like three different, there's a category, but there are these narration which are very authentic. Like we call them, this was some things, we call them the Hadith Qudsi, like this was not a revelation, but it could have been a revelation. Like Muslim take that very seriously. So there are three different categories, some are, fabricated, some are not. But they developed the good science for the chain of transmission. So they really kept a good record of, where it came from, who said it, how it started, and people's biography in between. So she mentioned the hadith. So that's the material where we take a lot of things in order to establish, also judicial system and stuff like that. Yes, please.
Among Muslims in this country, is it a problem in the family if the young Muslim wants to marry a non-Muslim?
That's a good question. It can be a big problem.
Well, so it depends. So when my husband and I got married, I was a very faithful, non-practicing Catholic. So it depends on who the person, like, if it's a
Other way
man or
around.
a woman.
Yeah.
And so men are allowed to marry any person of the book, and women are expected to marry a Muslim.
Yeah.
But even that, and the idea behind that, of course, is that, the man as like the head of the family, and not the dictator, but the head, in consultation with his partner, the head, is, kind of sets the tone. And so there would be some expectation that all of the prophets would be respected, which you would have, because you can't be a Muslim and not believe in all of the prophets. However, if a woman were to marry a man who was not Muslim, then he would not acknowledge Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so that would be an issue. Now, that being said, are there Muslim women who marry non-Muslim men? Absolutely, all the time. And sometimes they convert, and sometimes they don't, and people do all kinds of things.
Also, I feel that man has really a big responsibility. So, I mean, both do, but woman has a little bit more flexibility, especially in a marriage setting. So, men are responsible of providing. I mean, that's actually straight from the Quran, that they are the kind of a caretaker for the woman and the family. Now, that doesn't say, like I explained the first marriage, that women cannot, have wealth or they cannot provide. It's fine the other way around, perfectly. There's these are just the guidelines. So this way, if a woman brings, that's why the contract is needed in a marriage. If woman brought in a wealth in a marriage, that will be her. She does not have to share that Islamically with her husband, but she's allowed to with her own goodwill, if she wants to do that, but she's not obligated. But on the other way around, if men bring in a wealth into the marriage, that's why a woman is fully, entitled to that wealth. So when people come in and they say there is inequality inheritance for a woman, so inheritance laws are very clear in Islam. It's like, if you read the chapter, where it talks about inheritance, it's a pretty complicated math, like who gets what. That's why there's so many Muslim inventors for mathematics and algebra, and you see that because I think you needed it in order to interpret those laws. So it says, there are many other ways. There's a lot of guidelines and suggestions and rules, but one is that give 2 shares to the boy and 1 share to the girl. Now, that's all guidelines. If you don't have a boy, everything goes to the girl. So that's, beside that. But the reason is because it's kind of working towards this whole family system, where if a man brings in a wealth to the marriage, it belongs to the wife and to the children. So he has to kind of provide for them. But if woman brings in a wealth to the marriage, then she does not have to. And if she does it, she'll get more reward than a man, actually, because it's man's obligation. So at the same time, that's why women are encouraged to keep their maiden name. In majority of the Muslim world, you before the colonization, you would never see a Muslim woman take their husband's name. So that was we're doing it now. We are hyphenating it. But it's still, if you think about it's we're still kind of a little bit reluctant to, Yeah, go ahead.
How about politically? Does the Quran say anything about women in politics at all, or?
What did he say?
In politics. Oh. Yeah. So there were, just female leaders during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and referenced in the Quran. But the idea of politics is very interesting because Islamically, the way a leader is chosen is basically from the people. So the people observe, an individual's behavior. They look to see if this person, is trustworthy, is honest, is respectful of other people, is generous. And then the community comes to that person and says, will you lead us, right? So we're kind of the opposite here, right? It's actually a person decides, I want to be in charge. And then they get lots of money, and they get other people to say, oh yeah, we're going to help you get in charge. And so it's kind of a little reverse. But there's absolutely nothing that prohibits women from being involved in politics.
Actually, if some of you know, if you take in a world history and you know what's going on in the Muslim world, as much as trouble there is, but that's something the Muslim world is far ahead than the Western world as far as having a female leaders. Because many countries, like where I was born in Pakistan, actually not just Benazir Bhutto, when I was growing up, I was just maybe 9-10 years old, and very first election, a woman just lost by maybe few hundred votes. And I was actually crying because I already had a role model. She was Fatima Jinnah, a sister of the founder of Pakistan. And we were just, we couldn't vote, but we were into politics just because it was woman running, and she spoke so eloquently, and she could have been a first president of the very newly found country. So we already grew up, so it was very normal for us. It's like, the parliament members were Muslim, and even you look at countries like Iran and even countries like Iraq. So there were Muslim woman leader in Turkey, in Indonesia, and Bangladesh like 2-3 times. So really it was never something, it was very natural and some African nations. So it's become very natural for us to think that, because in Prophet's time, that really happened. Actually, I was just telling her one of the hadith that a Prophet was discussing some very serious matter between men and women, and Asma bin Yazid, her name was, very known Sahabiya, a companion of the Prophet, and she stood up and she made some profound point, time of the Prophet, and they say Prophet just turned around and he is like listening to this woman, and then he looked at the men and he said, have you ever heard anyone more eloquent than this woman? So it was really, for reading that, this kind of, tradition, we as a woman never really thought that we cannot be in politics. So I hope that answered your question. Yes, maybe we go on the back. Yeah.
How does the dynamic of marriage change when a husband becomes disabled and the woman needs to become the breadwinner? Mm-hmm. I'm dealing with that now. I have a Muslim girlfriend. Her husband got ALS, and he can't work. And she said it's just turned everything upside down in so many ways. Can you help me out with that one?
So do you mean in terms of financial support, role in the family, sexuality?
She's never worked. Oh, wow. That's a lot of people's story.
Yeah. So again, there's nothing, to prevent her from working.
She's not trained.
And, ideally, right, the community should come together and provide support as much as possible, right? As a matter of fact, it's one of the most beautiful things about Islam is that it is such a community-based experience. Like, the community is so important, and that, it's talked that the community of believers is like a single body, right? So like, when your hand isn't working, that the rest of the body feels that, right? That we struggle with that sometimes here in the United States because, it was also our tradition a long time ago, and we've kind of lost it, and we've, become very kind of individualistic, and not in ways that help us, right? So I work in primary care, and I look at, as we're moving away from all of these social supports, the incidence of anxiety and depression in primary care is like through the roof, because we know that being part of a community protects us, right? So I'm not sure how to answer that question because it clearly is a very challenging position that she's in. And do they have children? Yeah.
So, oh.
Oh.
Oh, wow. Oh. That is.
Yeah.
So is your question is that how religion would deal with it, or your question is that how community deals with it? Her. Yeah, but if she doesn't want to leave him, no one can force to. No one should force her, because that's definitely her decision, and she must be a very compassionate person. And I really think that at the end we are, as men and women, like, when God created us, he told the angels and the jinn, look, I'm creating this Khalifa, like a vice regent for to send on this earth. That means, in a sense, we all are steward. We have the stewardship, what is around us or what is under us, whether you're a man or a woman. And even if the role changes, you have to take that stewardship. So yeah, I mean, she has to take that role, and she can do the best way that she can. If the family doesn't help, then it's okay. I mean, she shouldn't cut off with them. That would be like what I would do in that situation. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a right advice, but what I would do is then I would really not take family's advice and maybe avoid them until I figure it out. But she definitely, if she's a strong woman, she could, she could do it. She has to realize that she is, if nobody is helping her, she's responsible of those children. And also the husband, even though, like she said, in a traditional sense, or in an Islamic sense, including the family and the community is responsible. So if they're not doing it, they're doing something wrong. So that's what. You have a question, right? She had a question, yeah.
More comments.
Okay.
I just wanted to reflect, this goes back a few comments about intention. You mentioned that. Mm-hmm. I think in Christianity, we were always taught, Jesus said, it's not enough to not act. You have to, like if you lust in your heart, that's still considered a sin. And I think any woman that's been looked up and down by a man and, is just would understand that. And also, I just wanted to respond to you to say that it's no longer, just marriage is no longer considered for procreation in Catholicism. That's changed. Because obviously, if an older couple gets married and they want to get married in the church, they're not going to have kids, so. Okay,
just to kind of respond to your comment about the intentions and the sin. Well, in Islam, we believe that if you thought of a sin and you didn't commit, we believe God is so merciful that he doesn't take that to an account to punish you. Actually, sin is a sin when it's acted upon. So. Any?
Let me ask one then.
Please do that.
Actually, I may have missed that part, but sorry if I did. Like in Surah Isra, I think it's mentioned that it doesn't say don't do adultery or unlawful sex. It says don't approach or don't get close to adultery or unlawful sex, right? Or you mentioned about the don't be behind the closed doors and other examples. So can we say that Islam is like trying to close the paths, like trying to prevent before it happens? Like all that acts are kind of close that circumstances happen that before, like puts that prevents before that it happens. Can we say like that? Do you think that it's an approach of Islam or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it won't prevent everything, but it certainly is geared towards ensuring safety and appropriateness of relationships. So yes, I would agree with that. Oh, here goes Art.
I just have one more before we go. Just being a former veteran of a foreign war, I was really, this is going a little off subject, but I really wanted to know, is the counseling for PTSD for all those soldiers coming back, to your knowledge, getting better, or is it still remaining the same? I just had to know because of your expertise.
So yes, I would say it's getting better. It's a long process, and I think that some of the focus has expanded, right, to include all service members, because a lot of what we learn from caring for wounded, ill, and injured service members, like those programs that we built, right, we realized that what works well for them really works well for everybody, and that a lot of people have those needs. We're also starting to understand a lot more about not only trauma, but vicarious trauma, right? And so when you are, living or working around people who have experienced trauma long enough, then you experience that vicariously as well. So, the number of people who this is impacting is really increasing exponentially. So, yeah.
I think he has a question on the back, or maybe comment. Actually, let me introduce, we have a very important person with us today, and kind of my colleague. He's actually a prison chaplain in the federal prison in in Frackville. And he's actually a scholar here, so he's listening to. So please correct us or make us a comment and give us your wisdom.
Yeah. Did we make a mess of everything?
Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah reward you for the beautiful presentation and the comments and questions. I'm not going to make any comment about what Sister Rubina just said about me. I pray to Allah that we are all like in the best of one another's thought about, the best of our thought about our sisters and brothers, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put us in that place and even in a better position. The quick, interesting thing that I really want to make a quick comment about was said by, I think it's the brother who just handed me the microphone now, about the ayah in Surah Al-Isra, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Because all of us at one level or another, when we become Muslims or trying to practice our deen and understand our religion, we would have to study Arabic and we would have to read the Quran in Arabic. So it's something that's of particular interest to those of us that are reading the Quran in Arabic or that are learning Arabic with a view to gaining better understanding of the Quran. So when he mentioned that ayah, and he said that it actually, perhaps the meaning is like, don't come close to fornication or adultery. So it reminds me of one important way by which we can understand the language of the Quran. We all know generally, either as natural speakers of any particular language or people who acquire that language is always operating at the level of the literal and the idiomatic. So That language of la taqrabu, it's an idiomatic expression. What it means, Allah knows best, is that don't do it. Why do we say that? That it is, what it means is don't do it. Because the Quran uses the same word in other places. For example, it says, La taqrabu salata wa antum sukara. Don't, if we want to interpret it literally, we say, don't come close to Salah when you are drunk. Is that what it means? No, it simply says, don't pray when you are drunk, leave prayer alone because you're not going to know what you're saying. And then in another verse, it says, these are the limits that Allah has set in terms of rules, do this, don't do this. And it says, فَلَا تَقْرَبُوهَا. And it says, as with respect to the prohibitions, don't come close to it. No, just don't do it. So we can check and try to gain an understanding of a word or a verse or a phrase in the Quran by looking at other places when the Quran has used the same thing. The good thing about the Quran is that there's hardly anything that is mentioned once. There's going to be several other mentioning of the same thing, and you're going to be able to come to some conclusion that this is, inshallah, this is what it means. I just wanted to share that brief.
Thank you so much for that clarification and good. We can take one more question. Nobody's.
So it's almost 9. If we don't have any other question, maybe, do we have any other? You said last one, but maybe. Okay, I think we are.
Okay.
Do you have any other comments before we finish? Anything you want to add?
Well, I guess one, if it's not too racy, just because I know there are a lot of questions about like the social aspects and marriage and courtship and so on and so forth, but specifically about sexuality. So one of the very unique things about women is that they don't experience desire until they've been aroused, right? Women don't understand this, so they often compare themselves to men. Men experience both simultaneously, so they don't have to figure it out. And so there's two kinds of arousal. For women, there's physical arousal, and then there's mental arousal, right? And so what mentally arouses women? Well, it's different depending on the woman, but what we know is a lot of it has to do with how safe and secure and protected and supported she feels in a relationship. That contributes to that mental arousal. So when we look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did all of those things, right? He cooked, he sewed his own clothing, like he was very supportive in the household. And I feel as though that's very consistent with what we know needs to occur, right? For couples to have a sexually healthy relationship, is that arousal is occurring mentally. And so it's very common, right, for women to say, oh my God, I'd love to come home and see my husband at the sink doing the dishes. Like there's nothing better, right? And there's a reason for that. And it contributes to, again, these feelings of safety and support, which eventually also work out well in terms of the bedroom. So to leave things on a high note, I just wanted to make that point because I think it's an important one.
So I guess I will make another point, which I actually heard one of my teacher, Ingrid Mattson, made over the weekend, and it was the same topic. And, she was talking about, sex is not a commodity. So this is something is very much consented between two, in a marriage, obviously, she's talking about. And she said another thing is, in order to teach a woman, you have to start that respect for yourself and for your body when they're babies. She said, like, we are in Muslim world, we are like very easygoing with the children and the girls, she said. And she gave an example. She said when she was raising her girls, that even if she wanted to hug her own daughter, she would ask her, may I give you a hug? She said, so this way that she realized that she already have a control on her body or a say that who can touch her or who can give her a hug. So she said it's really important to to start from, from that idea and put those kind of, thoughts in your younger children, and also the boys too. She said that it's really, I also feel that we sometimes forget that the stranger come around and they say, oh, your baby is so beautiful, let me give your baby a hug. So this way, sometimes kids are 2, 3, 4 years old and they don't want that. But we'll say, no, go give your auntie and uncle, a hug. And I never really thought about it before, and she said that it does something, psychologically or mentally to a human being. Like now they think that they have like no right over something which is there and which is sacred and which is to be protected. So I guess I will end with that. Thank you so much for listening to us.